Aisha Adetola was a young girl with big dreams. She came from a small village in Nigeria where everyone knew her as the smartest child. Her parents worked hard, farming and selling food at the market so she could go to school. When Aisha got a scholarship to study at Ibadan University, her whole village celebrated. It was a big deal because no one from her village had ever gone to university before. At Ibadan University, Aisha studied very hard. She wanted to become a doctor and help sick people in her village. She was doing well in all her classes, except for one, Professor Oba's course. Professor Oba was one of the most powerful lecturers at the university. Everyone respected him, but Aisha noticed something strange. Some students who didn't study much still passed his course, while hardworking students failed. One day after class, Professor Oba asked Aisha to stay back. She thought he wanted to help her with her studies, but he said something that made her feel scared. "Aisha," he said, smiling, "if you want to pass my course, you need to be close to me." Aisha didn't understand at first. "Close?" she asked. "Yes," Professor Oba said, leaning closer. "I can make sure you pass. But you must do something for me." Aisha felt her heart sink. She realized he was asking for something wrong. She shook her head and said, "No, sir. I just want to study and pass my exams." Professor Oba frowned. "Think about it," he said. "If you don't, you'll fail my course and your scholarship might be taken away." Aisha ran back to her room, crying. She knew her parents were counting on her to succeed, and she couldn't tell anyone. If she complained to the university, they might not believe her. But Aisha was brave. She decided to find a way to stop Professor Oba. The next day, Aisha borrowed a small recorder from her friend Kola, who loved fixing electronics. She hid the recorder in her bag and went to meet Professor Oba again. This time, she pretended to agree with him so she could record everything he said. "I will do what you want," she told him. "But can you promise I will pass?" Professor Oba laughed. "Of course, my dear. Just be nice to me, and I'll take care of you." When Aisha got back to her room, she listened to the recording. Her hands were shaking, but she knew this was her proof. She showed it to Kola, who helped her post it online. They shared it on Twitter, Facebook, and WhatsApp. Within hours, the story went viral. People were angry. Students started talking about how Professor Oba had done the same thing to others. Parents and journalists began asking questions. Even the university couldn't ignore it. But when the university held a meeting to investigate, something terrible happened. The panel, made up of other lecturers, said the recording was not enough proof. They said Aisha could have made up the story. "Professor Oba is a respected man," they said. "We cannot ruin his name without more evidence." Aisha felt crushed, but she wasn't ready to give up. She talked to other students and they decided to stand together. "If we all speak out, they can't ignore us," Aisha said. Now, the students were planning a big protest. They were making posters, writing letters, and spreading the word. Aisha knew it was risky. If the university punished her, she might lose her scholarship. But she also knew that staying silent would let people like Professor Oba keep hurting others. The day of the protest was coming. Aisha stood in her room, looking at the posters they had made. Her heart was pounding. Would the protest work? Would the university finally listen? Or would she lose everything she had worked so hard for? The morning of the protest arrived, and Aisha hardly slept the night before. Her mind was filled with thoughts of what could go wrong. She stood in the mirror, tying her scarf tightly, determined not to show fear. She thought about her parents and her village. They had so much hope in her, and she couldn't let them down. The students gathered in front of the university gate, holding signs and chanting slogans. The air was electric. Some signs read, "Justice for Aisha," and others said, "End corruption now." Kola stood by Aisha's side, holding a megaphone. "This is for all of us," he shouted. "If we don't stand together, nothing will change." At first, only a few lecturers peeked out from their offices, watching silently. Then, campus security arrived, trying to push the students away. "Go back to your hostels," one of the guards shouted. But the students refused to move. As the crowd grew, reporters arrived with cameras. They took pictures and asked Aisha questions. "Why are you doing this?" one of them asked. Aisha took a deep breath and spoke into the microphone. "I am doing this because it's not just about me. There are many students who have been silenced, many who have suffered. We want a university where students can succeed without fear." Her words spread like wildfire. People outside the university began tweeting and posting videos of the protest. Parents, former students, and even some lecturers started to show support online. But then, something unexpected happened. The university sent out a public announcement, claiming that Aisha and the protesting students were disturbing the peace. "The university will not tolerate such behavior," the statement read. "All students involved will face disciplinary action." When the announcement reached the protest, some students grew scared. They didn't want to risk being expelled. One by one, a few started to leave. Aisha's heart sank as she watched the crowd shrink. "Don't go," she pleaded. "If we stop now, nothing will change." Kola stepped forward and grabbed the megaphone again. "They are trying to scare us," he said. "But we have to stay strong. If we leave, they win." Aisha looked around. Even though some had left, many students stayed. Their faces were filled with determination. She knew this wasn't over. Suddenly, loud sirens filled the air. A convoy of police vans pulled up, and officers stepped out, holding shields and batons. The crowd grew quiet, but no one moved. An officer with a booming voice spoke through a loudspeaker. "Disperse immediately, or we will use force." Aisha's heart pounded. She turned to Kola, who looked just as scared as she felt. "What do we do now?" she whispered. Kola clenched his fists. "We stand our ground," he said. "They can't arrest all of us." The officers began to march toward the crowd. Some students took a step back, unsure of what to do. Aisha felt a tear roll down her cheek, but she wiped it quickly. She couldn't show fear now. Just as the officers reached the front of the crowd, a group of older people appeared. Parents, activists, and alumni who had seen the videos online. They stood between the students and the police. "If you want to touch these children," one of the parents shouted, "you'll have to go through us first." The tension was thick. No one knew what would happen next. Would the police back down? Would the university finally listen? Or would things get worse? The crowd fell silent, all eyes fixed on the police and the brave parents standing in their path. The officers hesitated. It wasn't every day they faced older community members willing to defend students. The lead officer lowered his megaphone and exchanged whispers with his colleagues. The students watched, their breaths held, waiting for the next move. Aisha felt a surge of hope as more people joined the growing crowd. A prominent alumnus of Ibadan University, known for advocating justice, arrived with a small entourage of reporters and lawyers. His name was Olumide Ikenna, a man respected nationwide for fighting corruption. As he stepped forward, cameras flashed, and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Olumide raised his hand, signaling for silence. "These students have shown courage," he said, his voice firm but calm. "They are here because they want a better university, a fair university. And instead of addressing their concerns, you want to silence them? Shame on you." The crowd erupted in applause and cheers. The officers exchanged nervous glances, unsure how to handle the growing attention. The journalists started broadcasting live, and social media exploded with hashtags like #JusticeForAisha and #EndCorruptionInSchools. People from all over the country were watching. Meanwhile, inside the university's administrative building, Professor Oba watched the chaos unfold on his computer screen. His face twisted with anger. "These children think they can destroy me," he muttered. He picked up his phone and made a call. "We need to shut this down now. Get the vice-chancellor to make an official statement." In the crowd, Aisha and Kola stood shoulder to shoulder, still holding their signs. Aisha noticed some students whispering nervously. "Do you think they'll really expel us?" one girl asked. "We have to be ready for anything," Kola said, his voice steady. "But if we give up now, everything Aisha has been through will be for nothing." Suddenly, the university's loudspeakers crackled to life. The vice-chancellor's voice boomed across the campus. "Attention, students and members of the community," he began. "We understand your concerns. but this protest is disrupting academic activities and tarnishing the university's image. We urge everyone to disperse immediately. Failure to do so will result in severe consequences." The crowd groaned in frustration, but Aisha grabbed the megaphone. "This isn't just about me," she shouted. "It's about all of us. If we leave now, they'll think they've won. Are we going to let them scare us into silence?" "No," the students roared back. As the standoff continued, something unexpected happened. A group of lecturers joined the protest. They were younger staff members who had faced intimidation from senior professors like Oba. One of them, Dr. Funmaleo, stepped forward. She looked directly at the police and raised her voice. "These students are right," she said. "We cannot allow corruption to destroy our institution. If you silence them, you silence the truth." The students erupted into cheers again, their spirits lifted. Aisha felt tears welling up in her eyes, but this time, they were tears of gratitude. For the first time, she didn't feel alone. But the police weren't leaving. They stood firm, waiting for orders. Aisha knew the next few minutes could decide everything. If the crowd didn't disperse, things could turn violent. If they did, all their efforts might go to waste. The tension grew unbearable as the lead officer stepped forward again, gripping his baton. The crowd tensed, bracing for what might come next. The lead officer stood before the crowd, his baton gripped tightly. The air felt heavy, and even the birds seemed to stop chirping. Everyone held their breath, waiting for his next move. Suddenly, Alyamide Ikenna, the respected alumnus, stepped in front of the officer and raised his hand. "Officer, think carefully about your actions," he said. "This is more than a protest. It's a cry for justice. Are you going to stand on the wrong side of history?" The officer hesitated, his grip loosening. He turned and looked at his team, then back at the growing crowd of students, parents, journalists, and even lecturers. Slowly, he stepped back and spoke into his radio. "Stand down," he ordered. "We're not escalating this." A collective sigh of relief swept through the crowd, followed by cheers. But the fight wasn't over. The Vice-Chancellor's earlier statement still loomed over them, threatening consequences. As the sun began to set, the protesters decided on one final move. Alyamide and Dr. Funmaleo led Aisha and Kola into the administrative building, where a panel of university officials, including the Vice-Chancellor and Professor Oba, were waiting. The room was tense as Aisha stepped forward, clutching the recorder that had captured Oba's incriminating words. With her voice steady, she played the recording for everyone in the room to hear. Gasps filled the air as the evidence became undeniable. Professor Oba tried to defend himself. "This is a setup," he yelled. "She's lying." But Dr. Funmaleo stood up. "Enough, Oba. We all know what you've been doing. It's time to face the consequences." The Vice-Chancellor, under immense pressure from the public outcry and the protest, had no choice but to take action. "Professor Oba," he said, his voice heavy, "you are hereby suspended pending further investigation. If found guilty, you will be dismissed." The news spread quickly. The protesters outside erupted into cheers when they heard the announcement. For the first time, students felt like their voices had been heard. Aisha's courage had paved the way for change. Over the following weeks, the university began reviewing its policies to prevent such abuse of power. More students came forward with similar stories, and Professor Oba was eventually dismissed and charged for his actions. The lead officer raised his hand, signaling his team to hold their positions. The crowd was eerily quiet, the only sound being the occasional rustling of the protest signs in the wind. Then he spoke, his voice firm but slightly hesitant. "Listen, everyone," the officer began. "I don't want violence. But orders are orders. If this crowd doesn't clear in the next 5 minutes, we'll have no choice but to intervene." Gasps rippled through the students. Aisha's hands tightened around her sign. She could feel the weight of everyone's hopes pressing on her shoulders. She glanced at Kola, who gave her a small nod, silently encouraging her to speak again. Aisha stepped forward, gripping the megaphone. Her voice was trembling but loud enough to carry over the crowd. "Officer, we're not here to cause trouble. We are here because we want justice. If you move against us, you're not just hurting students, you're protecting people like Professor Oba, who use their power to harm others. Is that what you want to be remembered for? The officer paused, visibly uncomfortable. Some of his colleagues shifted uneasily, clearly questioning their orders. The tension was palpable. But before anyone could react further, another voice rang out. Aisha is right, Dr. Funmaleo shouted, stepping forward. She turned to face the officer directly. This university has been rotting from the inside for years. If you silence these students, you're part of the problem. You have a chance to stand on the right side of history. Choose wisely. The officer hesitated again, his grip on the baton loosening. He looked over his shoulder at the vice-chancellor's office, where he could see senior university officials watching through the windows. Their faces were hard to read, but their presence loomed like a shadow over the entire scene. Just then, Alyamide Ikenna, the respected alumnus, stepped forward with his lawyers. Officer, he said firmly, if you touch these students, I will make sure this incident is reported to the highest authorities in this country. Do you think the public, who is already watching this live, will stand for it? Your career could be on the line. The officer swallowed hard. He glanced at his team, then back at the growing crowd of students, parents, and lecturers. The sheer number of people standing together seemed to shift something in him. He raised his hand again, this time signaling his team to step back. Cheers erupted from the crowd, and for the first time that day, Aisha felt a flicker of hope. But she knew this wasn't the end. The university was still trying to protect Professor Oba, and she couldn't stop now. As the police retreated to the sidelines, Aisha turned to the students. This is our chance, she said, her voice stronger now. We've come this far, but we need to keep going. If we stay united, they can't ignore us. The crowd cheered again, louder this time. Aisha noticed some of the students who had left earlier returning, their courage reignited by the moment. Kola leaned over to her and whispered, "We're making history, Aisha." But as the protest gained more momentum, the vice-chancellor's office sent out another statement, this time on social media. It accused Aisha of fabricating her story to gain attention and disrupt the university. They called her a troublemaker and threatened to release documents claiming she had poor academic performance, a blatant lie. When Kola read the statement aloud to the crowd, a wave of anger swept through them. "How dare they?" one student shouted. "We know the truth." Aisha clenched her fists, anger and fear battling inside her. She knew the university was trying to break her spirit, to make her look like the villain. But she also knew that backing down now would mean letting them win. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from an unknown number. She hesitated, then opened it. The message read, "Be careful. They are planning to make you disappear. Watch your back." Her blood ran cold. She showed the message to Kola, who frowned deeply. "This is serious, Aisha," he said. "They're getting desperate." Aisha felt a chill run down her spine, but she straightened her shoulders. "Let them try," she said, her voice steady. "I'm not giving up." The protest continued into the evening, the crowd growing as more people joined in solidarity. But Aisha couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was about to get even more dangerous. As the evening sky turned a deep orange, the protest swelled to its largest size yet. Students, lecturers, parents, and alumni stood shoulder to shoulder, chanting for justice. The university gates were now surrounded by people carrying signs and banners, their voices echoing across the campus. Aisha stood in the middle of the crowd, her hands trembling but her spirit unbroken. She knew the battle wasn't just for her. It was for every student who had been silenced, every lecturer who feared speaking out, and every parent who dreamed of a better future for their children. Just as the sun dipped below the horizon, a convoy of black SUVs pulled up to the scene. Out stepped government officials, accompanied by a representative from the Ministry of Education. The crowd fell silent as the officials approached. One of them, a stern-looking man in a crisp suit, raised his hand to address the protesters. "We have seen the videos, read the reports, and heard your voices," he began. "We are here to ensure justice is served." The crowd erupted into cheers, but the man quickly motioned for silence. However, he continued, this is not an easy fight. Corruption has deep roots, but with your courage, we can begin to pull them out. The officials announced that a special investigative panel would be set up to look into Professor Oba's actions, as well as other cases of misconduct at the university. They also declared that no students involved in the protest would face expulsion or disciplinary action. Aisha felt a wave of relief wash over her, but she wasn't ready to celebrate yet. What about Professor Oba? She asked, her voice clear and unwavering. Will he be allowed to keep teaching while you investigate? The official nodded solemnly. Effective immediately, Professor Oba is suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. The crowd erupted into cheers again, this time louder than ever. Tears streamed down Aisha's face as she hugged Kola and Dr. Funmaleo. She had stood her ground, and for the first time, it felt like the world was listening. 3 months later, the investigation revealed overwhelming evidence against Professor Oba, not only from Aisha's recording but from other victims who came forward during the protest. He was dismissed from his position and faced legal charges for his actions. The university implemented new policies to protect students from harassment and created an independent body to handle complaints. Aisha's bravery became a symbol of hope for students across Nigeria. Her story inspired nationwide reforms in universities, sparking a movement for accountability and transparency in education. Though the journey was hard, Aisha returned to her studies with renewed determination. She knew the fight for justice didn't end with one victory, but she was proud to have lit the spark. Moral lesson: courage and unity can bring about change, even in the face of great injustice. Aisha's story teaches us that standing up for what is right, even when it seems impossible, can inspire others to do the same. It reminds us that silence allows corruption to thrive, but speaking out, especially together, can break even the strongest chains of oppression. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed our story. Please like, share, and subscribe. Bye for now.